Now, also, like, if you move away from D&D, which does seem to be killing low fantasy, there are other games that are still very low fantasy. You have plenty of OSR games that are going to be much closer to first edition D&D and second edition.
Well, I mean, literally, there's a rule set to do just about anything, in a fantasy world, and then, reaching beyond, into modern and future and sci-fi. So there's plenty of different rule sets to look at. But we're tended to look at D&D because, that's the most popular one that's out there.
We say that D&D is killing low fantasy. Is there any evidence to this?
I'm Nerdarchy Ted.
And I'm Nerdarchy Dave.
Welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds, by nerds. All right, so we kind of got, an interesting topic to talk about today.
Yeah, so today we're talking about has D&D killed low fantasy?
All right, so I guess, this is a big, hot button topic. It's definitely been something that we have kind of struggled and battled with for years, in our own personal gaming group, and there's definitely been some changes. But I think first we should describe, what does low fantasy mean?
Low fantasy would be definitely first and second edition D&D. Started off very low fantasy. Your classics like Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit are much more low fantasy. The more fantastical elements, they're there, but they're kind of like spread out. And if you really like start dissecting some of the stuff that gets done, the things that are considered more fantasy-esque, they're going to be, kind of mild compared to some of the things that happen in a D&D game.
So I would look at it, and as far removed as the average person on a daily life of seeing magic, the further it is, the lower fantasy it is. And as we get further and further into, these campaign settings and what have you, and more rule sets come out that offer things that are, whoa, to me that says all right, we're moving further and further away from that aspect that magic is not so rare, but it's, getting more and more common.
Yeah. Well, also too, a lot of the low fantasy draws heavily from Western, medieval, European style stories and things like that. And I think, and as far as I know, I think if you get into other cultures and other types of fantasy stories, and the low part may not be as prevalent as it is in those settings.
Right.
If I'm mistaken, let me know in the comments if you have other sources you would like to point out to us. That'd be really cool, and to share with the Nerdarchy community. Down in the comments below, please do. But speaking from my understanding. Now, also, like, if you move away from D&D, which does seem to be killing low fantasy, there are other games that are still very low fantasy. You have plenty of OSR games that are going to be much closer to first edition D&D and second edition.
Well, I mean, literally, there's a rule set to do just about anything, in a fantasy world, and then, reaching beyond, into modern and future and sci-fi. So there's plenty of different rule sets to look at. But we're tended to look at D&D because, that's the most popular one that's out there.
We say that D&D is killing low fantasy. Is there any evidence to this?
All right. Well, for those of you who, might not be familiar with the channel, we've been playing for over 30 years. Dave started with first edition. I started with second edition. And other than maybe a 6-month block, we have been gaming for well over 30 years each, and consistently. So we've played throughout all the editions. And, I look back to third edition, where at that point in time, we were very much you only play fantasy, and anything that could be slightly construed as sci-fi or, future tech, we wanted nothing of it at our table. And then Wizards did this awesome thing where they did a competition to say, make a unique setting. And lo and behold, Keith Baker won, brought in Eberron. And so many of us were just blown away at all of these things. The lightning rails, the magic train, artificers, warforged. And it was yeah, you got your chocolate and my peanut butter. You got your peanut butter and my chocolate. It was awesome, but it was one of the first steps to bringing, magic to commonplace, to the world that everybody gets to see, and it's not a Lord of the Rings kind of situation where magic was so far removed that it was almost a myth more than an actual thing.
There was a company called Legends and Lairs, I believe, and they put out, or maybe that's the name of the series of the books they put out. But one of them was a kind of like a steampunk, steam-powered supplement. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but I even think prior to Eberron, I started getting a little bored. And I remember in one of the dungeons, I used undead goblin zombies piloting steam-powered armor on you guys. And there was a little bit more elements of sci-fi in that particular dungeon.
You know, and like those kind of things happen. Every time that there's a little bit of, well, can you taste, this little bit, the first sample's free, whatever. But more and more companies see, oh, okay, this is okay. And now we look at all of these different things. I mean, we got Spelljammer that's released. We've got Eberron. And like these are mixing with your standard D&D games. Spaceships can, totally come into the planet, or you find the ship on the planet and then you take off and you go off into the wild yonder, totally doing that sci-fi style game with a D&D, verse. And if you really take it in another direction, if you look at things like Ravenloft, where the magic of undeath is so permeated in the world that the people are terrified of it. I know Ravenloft does kind of borderline on a modern-esque game because it's more Victorian era.
Some of them. It just depends on what realm you're in.
I'm not as familiar, but yeah. I know that aspect.
They also lean into mad science sometimes instead of undead type horror. It's very interesting in that way. But I would like to break it down even further, right? You have first edition. That's basically, okay, how do we play Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, and a bunch of other things matched together, right? That's straight up low fantasy. Second edition, we get a lot more options into the game. Power creep happens, right? With those options. Third edition, this more of the same, more options, more power creep, right? Fourth edition, it's kind of the same, right? And fifth edition, it just keeps ratcheting up. And the reason why that kills low fantasy is, along with all these other things that are happening, these more options, these more power, they're also adding a lot more magic into the game. And by the time you play fifth edition, every single class option has magic options, including the barbarian at this point, right?
Indeed.
There is not a class that does not have magic options. So many of the races have magical features that, they can draw upon magic. It is impossible to play low magic in 5e without stripping out so much of the game, that is there, right? Because it is so magic based. You're more equivalent to being a superhero than you are to being a fantasy hero at this point.
You'd have to say you can play a fighter, you can play a rogue, you can play a barbarian, you can play a monk, because everything else gets access to spells at its core, and then you'd have to restrict what subclasses you could play within those four subsets, and that's just not as much fun and takes away from what the core of D&D is.
Well, I don't know if it's not as much fun, but at that point I feel like it could be just easier to play a different game.
Sure.
Right? You could do that, and there are even optional rules in the DMG. And granted, one of the things is it takes a week to do a long rest. Well, even if you had your magical characters at this point, well, they're gonna start expending a lot of their resources except for their cantrips, which still would make them a lot more magical than previous editions.
Well, I mean, if you look at a low-level wizard in second edition when we were playing, you got your one or two spells, and that's it. And if one of them happened to be mage armor, it's all right, I've got one offensive thing that I can do today, and that's it. After that, I have to use a bow or throw a dagger or, one of a number of other things that is all right, what are we carrying this dude around for? Whereas the fighter could just keep swinging their sword. And, fourth edition, as you talked about the power creep, fourth edition, started that power of spells that had at-will abilities. And I was amazed when I played, I believe it was a wizard who had an area grid that did a little bit of fire damage, and I could just do it all day long. And I'm like,
You mean I don't have to use a crossbow?
this is just amazing. And then, like 3rd edition introduced the orisons, or like the 0th level spells.
There are cantrips and orisons, yeah.
Yeah, but it was a scenario of like, all right, you could cast these so many times a day, but 4th made them at will. And then, 5th edition is just like, all right, yeah, you get these things. So like having that spellcaster is like, all right, this is my go-to. I no longer need to have some kind of weapon on me for when I run out of spells. So this is like, blows the mind for what things kind of keep taking this. And then now on top of that, now you get races that as a whole, they all know a cantrip or access to magic. It takes things even further up the chain of that power creep. Was like, yeah, you play this race, everybody can use magic. You don't?
So, I guess we explained like kind of how we got here and why we think low fantasy for 5e is basically dead. Play Morkborg, right? You want low fantasy, play Morkborg. It's a lot of fun. It's a great game. Doesn't matter. Do we care?
Well, it's going to matter to some people. As far as, I'm particularly concerned, I like playing the rule set that we have, and the monsters are absolutely ratcheted up, and the power level of the threats are always have the ability to be higher, deadlier, more dangerous, what have you. So it's a matter of, if you find this game compelling and you like all of these extra things, well then sure, just, keep on smiling and keep on rolling dice.
Yeah, I have to concur. I mean, I think it's a lot of fun. I like having a lot of options. We're still playing and telling fun stories together as a group. I haven't felt compelled to move away from D&D. Like I said, if I want a grittier, different type of gaming experience, I would just play a different game. And occasionally we do that, right?
You check out Morkborg, you check out Shadow of the Demon Lord. Both of them offer a grittier, deadlier style. Both of them are fantasy games. If you've watched a number of videos here on the channel, you'll know that I'm very much a fan of Shadow of the Demon Lord. It's not going to be my go-to game because it is far deadlier. But, the options that it has are pretty compelling and interesting and are different than what D&D offers. But D&D has been the staple of my RPG experience for most of my life at this point in time.
Yeah, so, with that being said, play what's fun for you. If you want to play low fantasy, check out one of those other games, or even ones we haven't mentioned. There's tons of games out there. And if you like being, super heroic and very cinematic in your games, I think, D&D is moving in the right direction for that. We'll see what we get with the next version of D&D.
Indeed. So if you like this video, others like it, as well as all the great content you can find over at nerdarchy.com, why not come check us out over on Patreon and support us over there?
Articles like making a low magic campaign for 5e D&D work.
But if you're looking for another way to help support out Nerdarchy, why not come check out Nerdarchy the Store? Over there you'll find great products like The Dark Path, Encounter with a Winter Lord. The 5th edition content in this book explores new, darker paths for adventurers to follow. Beginning down one of these dark paths leads to power, but at a perilous cost. Heroes of the Dark face insurmountable odds and challenging decisions, whether it is worth the cost to fight against such forces by tapping into the same source of insidious influence as their terrible foes. 3 scenarios ready to drop right into your 5th edition games illustrate the dark power and influence caused by beings of malediction infiltrating your campaign world. Each encounter challenges heroes in a unique way, and surviving these perilous circumstances can set adventurers on a dark path to discovering terrible truths. Included within are Icespire challenges, 2nd level characters with a dangerous trap beset by horrid undead. Drop Ghoul plunges 4th edition heroes into frigid danger and a race against time. Frozen Lake tests 5th level heroes with traversing treacherous terrain to end the emanations of evil. Included are new magic items, the Orb of Ice Spires and the Spectral Lantern, and a new monster, the Drop Ghoul.
So let us know what you think about D&D and low fantasy, or maybe you have suggestions for your favorite low fantasy games. Drop them down in the comments below and share them with the Nerdarchy community.
While you're down there, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Go ahead and click on that notification bell so you don't miss a single video.
Quick reminder, we drop new videos here several times a week, so come on back. But you can't wait till then. No worries, we got you covered. Check out how to make a low-level D&D adventure exciting. AGM 911.
So until next time,
Stay nerdy.